One.
Hi everyone, I'm Lloyd, Vice President of Programs here at the Tenement Museum. I'm so excited to be here with you all tonight, to be here with our collections manager, Lana Dubin, for our first ever virtual visit. Probably many of you have been to tenement talks that we've hosted in our recreated apartment spaces. Probably many of you have been here on site. You've probably joined us on Zoom for our virtual tours, but tonight is something special. We are live in the recreated apartment of Joseph and Rachel Moore, and we're actually going to get to show you around the space, highlight some of the objects that we've acquired to be able to tell Joseph and Rachel's story. And please be patient with us because this is the first time we've ever done this. Hear from you as during any of our programs and tours. Please feel free to share your questions, your connections, ideas, and we'll keep this really interactive, just like we would if you were here with us at 97 Orchard Street. I do have to thank our sponsors for our virtual programs, the National Parks Foundation, Con Edison, the Department of Cultural Affairs, and of course, all of you. These programs are really possible because of your generous support and your connections to these stories make our families all the more real. So, Lana, hello.
Yes, hello.
So excited to get to dig in a little bit to this space that we're in, to the family who's here. So we're in the home now of Joseph and Rachel Moore, right? And we, are able to recreate this using a lot of different methods. We'll get to talking about that throughout the program tonight, right? How we kind of create the space that we're in. But I also wanted to give us a sense of just whose home we're in, because maybe not everyone has actually been here or seen the new exhibit. Joseph and Rachel Moore were a Black couple who lived in New York in the Rachel came here in the 1840s, actually, late 1840s. Joseph comes here in the 1850s, and we've set this apartment to 1870. So by that point, actually, they're not really new New Yorkers anymore. They've been here for, in Rachel's case, like, goodness, I can't do the math that fast.
30 years.
Yeah, a long time. She was from upstate New York, Kingston area. Joseph was from New Jersey, and they're making a home here. They actually live on Lawrence Street, so you're probably familiar with this, everyone who's watching, but this is the first family that we've talked about where they lived in a different tenement. They lived in today's Soho, as we know it. At that point, it was called the 8th Ward. They are sharing a 2-room apartment with 5 people. So it's Joseph and Rachel, and we'll talk about where everyone sleeps and sort of the arrangements, how they would be setting up day to day. But Joseph and Rachel have what were then called boarders, what we would today call roommates. They live with Rachel's stepdaughter, Jane. She's 23. And then also with an Irish immigrant, Rose Brown. She's 35. And then Rose's son, Louis, who's 14. And he's one of the many New Yorkers in this neighborhood who's both Black and Irish. So we'll talk a bit about that as we sort of move through the different objects and how we use the objects to tell the stories of the different people in this home. But just to set the scene for us a little bit, right? Imagining this kitchen space that we're in right now at this time of day. It's 6:30 here in New York.
It's dinner time.
It's dinner time. That's where I want to start. I always love the kitchen spaces here in our apartments. So behind me, right, we have this coal stove. We have one of these in all of our 19th and early 20th century recreated apartments. Why is the stove it's a little bit different, right, than the other ones we have? So Rachel will be doing cooking, but what else? Yeah, what else is going on here?
Really special stove, other than the fact that it's so ornate, which we get quite a lot of questions about. Seeing that this is a working class family with multiple people living here, the stove seems particularly decorative. And so this stove, in addition to being very beautiful, is extra large. It's a really long stove. And this is because this is not just used for cooking their dinner and their meals. The family was also using this to wash clothes. And so the women in this household were what we call washerwomen. So you could see from the line of laundry hanging up, as well as, I'm going to slightly move out of frame so you could see on the floor next to my water bottle, this bucket of washing with a washboard and a stick. And so what these women were doing was they were taking in washing from other people, perhaps in the neighborhood, perhaps uptown, cleaning it and then delivering it to them. And so they were using this home as a workspace in addition to a dinner time ritual. So you can imagine that they're finishing up with their laundry around this type of day, and they're going to be cleaning everything, hanging things up to dry. The stove is still hot, the stove is still running, and they're going to start cooking their dinner on it. So this stove, it's kind of going throughout the whole day, and it's a beautiful day here today in New York City. It's gorgeous, like 70 degrees, but you can also imagine with this stove going all day long, it is much hotter in here for the people who are living here.
Yeah, and how much harder it would be then to wash clothes when you're running a coal stove, trying to keep everything clean from soot. And what always strikes me about this particular home is that there's 3 adult women, right? You have Rachel, who's listed on the census without a paid occupation. Of course, we know she's the one really running this household, but Rose and Jane are, each doing their own work for pay, and then Shorley are assisting Rachel with getting dinner prepared. Makes me wonder just about the balance of work.
Right, and it's such a small space too. You have 3 women. If you're thinking about who's cooking dinner, are they each cooking their own meals? Are they sharing meals? Are they each taking in their own washing or perhaps sharing the load? And so it's really interesting to think about how this family is sharing responsibilities, but then also sharing things that we think about that families would share as like a nuclear family, like dinner time. How is that operating in this space?
Yeah, absolutely. And we really see, right, as the our lead researcher, Marquise Taylor, has researched in particular sort of how Black women were forming and reforming families through loss, through the struggles of racism at the time, right? We're in the middle of the end of the Civil War by the time we get to the period we're set in, but how that kind of strategy is so necessary in the home. And you really see that strategy actually in one of our main inspirations for recreating this space. Most of the resources that we can find describing Black New Yorkers' tenement apartments were written in white authored newspapers. Yes. So we don't really get to see the true sense of it being, these spaces being homes until we find an essay written by, he was the first Black doctor in the US. His name was James McCune Smith. And he wrote a series of essays about the lives of Black working class New Yorkers. And one of them is about the washerwoman. And so, we're able to draw this inspiration for this wash tub. You said it was sort of hot in this apartment. McCune Smith uses the phrase hot as an oven to describe the whole kitchen, right? So we have the stove, but thinking about, just that sensory experience and then how someone like Rachel, or Jane, how would they be making the space a home? Right. And food would be so central to that, right? Absolutely. Of how do you make this space feel like a home? So tell us a little bit about the food in this space.
Sure. So I'm going to start with the food that's cooking away right now, which is, as Kat said earlier, these are New Yorkers. They've lived here for 30 years, if not more. And the most New York food at the time were these oysters. They were ubiquitous. They were cheap. And since there's no real refrigeration in this space and it's hot as an oven, they were going outside and getting fresh groceries every single day. That was part of running this home. And so they would be purchasing oysters off the street from different carts, either eating them fresh or bringing them in and poaching them in this beautiful oyster poacher that we have right here. And the oysters are in a shell. Can this be seen? Is it beautiful? So the oysters are in the shell, and there are 5 different holes, and it's almost like a egg poacher where you could shuck the oyster with I'm actually going to hold it. So Kat did not.
We were joking before this started. You're allowed to break our no touching rules.
So
but you wash your hands.
I washed my hands. They're clean. They're dry. And I'm also responsible for the conservation. So if I break anything, that's on me, and I will fix it. So what we have here is a actual 1860s oyster shucker. And so you could see that the handle is completely attached. This thing is for utility. It is for getting as many oysters as we can out. So you can imagine that they would shuck the oyster and then almost crack it like an egg with its juices into this little poacher. And so that way, each oyster is perfectly poached in its little juice, and you can make things like chowder or stews. There's plenty of beautiful recipes for this. So this was like a really inexpensive, everyday type meal.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder, just thinking about, this household and who they're connected to, right? Like who Rachel is buying the oysters from, where the oysters are coming from. And we actually, just this week, got some I think it was last week, we got some very exciting new information about Louis Munday's father, Rose's first husband. Turns out he runs an oyster saloon when they first get married.
Oh my
you didn't
goodness!
even know this
No,
yet.
I'm learning this in real time. I'm not acting. Genuine reaction. That's amazing.
Which really hints at this much more important story about the role of Black Americans in the oyster industry, right?
Yes.
Both selling them in saloons and restaurants. In fact, George and Thomas Downing become very well known Black New Yorkers who run an oyster restaurant. But his name was Munday. No, Enos Brown. Goodness. Enos Brown runs an oyster saloon.
My goodness.
And as well, too, we were able to find out that at this, Marquise Taylor, a researcher, found out that a lot of the oysters at this time were actually coming from Virginia. So, like in the early 1860s, were being removed from their beds in Virginia, often by enslaved people, and then brought north and then sold in New York. So by 1870, that wouldn't have necessarily been the case, but just thinking about how this industry evolves, and how the food in New York City that's sold here is coming from all over.
Right. And we have a Irish family and a Black family living together and then sharing the same food, which is such a ubiquitous New York food. And so that connection between the two is really beautiful in the story of the oyster, you can tell.
Yeah. And we hadn't really realized until recently just how much closer, like for example, Rose might be to this industry, being the former wife of someone who runs one of these saloons.
Runs a saloon. And speaking of Rose as well, we have a couple of goodies that Rose has baked. Over here, we have some Irish soda bread. So when we were imagining this exhibit, we were imagining that multiple women, all of the women are really sharing in the responsibilities, but of course Rachel is the head of the household for the women. So we have a nice big slab of butter, as well as some beautiful fake faux Irish soda bread. And in addition to this beautiful soda bread, I also want to highlight my favorite object. I'm going to say that about everything that I point out. Like, who am I kidding? One of my favorite objects, which is this turkey carcass over here. So in that article, the washerwoman, they describe how the washerwoman is picking up her clothing uptown and bringing it down here, washing it, and when she's complete, she goes and delivers the clean clothes back to the person that she was washing them for. And in exchange for this service, she gets a half-eaten turkey carcass. And so that half-eaten turkey carcass is right there. And we worked with a historic foods creator who actually she purchased a turkey, roasted it and carved it, and cast it in a big vessel, and then pouring in an inert material that wouldn't react to anything and would stay basically as preserved as it is now for a longer period of time. And she created this turkey carcass for us and then painted it. And so we have this super realistic turkey carcass, but also thinking about what that means, that the washerwoman in McCune Smith's article is exchanging labor for food. She's not getting any payment back for that service.
Right. And thinking about, instances where that might happen, and how, someone like Rachel, who we know worked as a washerwoman before she married Joseph, and at that point, she was a single mom. Her first husband had passed away. She was working washing clothes. And, how do you navigate if your employer tries to pay you in food rather than in money. Just one of the challenges that Rachel might have had to figure out how to deal with. And then just that sense of reuse and how, she would be turning that into stock.
Right.
And making sure that all of the parts got used. And perhaps there's only maybe one day a week when everyone in this household actually sits down to a meal together. So she might also be thinking about how do you stage out things that people can eat during different times of day. Because at this point, right, if we're here around, almost dinner time, Joseph is actually already out at work, right? He works seasonally as a waiter, as a coachman, driving a horse and carriage. So whichever job he's doing, whatever season it is, he's not here at dinner time.
Exactly.
And we have a few things throughout the space that he would be either taking with him when he goes to work or using to get ready. And one of them has become many of our favorite objects.
This
it's
is
right here
really
next to the
special. So this object, we acquired it from the Netherlands. So many of these objects are, and I hate using this word because everything is real, everything is authentic in its own way, but this is an actual 1860s coachman's foot warmer. And so Rachel is also involved in getting her husband ready for work. She's packing him perhaps a little piece of Irish soda bread and butter or cheese to take with him to work. And she's loading this gorgeous foot warmer with coals. So again, I'm going to demonstrate with my hands. So you can see this handle here. This is so he can bring it around with him. But this is made out of copper. And so
it gets hot,
So it gets hot, exactly. And so there's these holes on top. And what happens is you take this lid off, and you can see it's a full copper chamber. And then you pull this drawer out. And so Rachel would have taken these hot coals, loaded them up into this drawer, the cherry red, and then the heat would have come out, keeping him warm on these cold New York City streets as he's driving his carriage. And you put your feet on either side of it. So.
And you just think about the timing of that too, of Rachel, like, okay, right before he leaves the house, because you don't want them to lose too much heat.
Exactly.
And, we don't know exactly where Joseph worked, whether it was for a private family or, for hire. But we do know that there was a horse stable just behind and next to their building. So we've been imagining that maybe if he does have, his own horse or a horse that he's renting from someone, that maybe that horse is right there and he doesn't have to go far with
he
the
doesn't,
foot
it doesn't get too cold as he walks to over where he's driving the horse.
Right, exactly. And, just as he is leaving for work, Lewis might be coming home. That Lewis is listed as going to school for some amount of time during the year. There's a school for Black students just on the next block. So that's a big part of what we talk about on the tour, is how education was really central for Black New Yorkers forming mutual aid and stability for themselves in this both lead up to emancipation and post-emancipation. But Lewis might also be working, right? If we have 5 people sharing an apartment, we know that the budget is tight, and the school had a night school. So it's also possible that even as he's coming home, maybe he helped his mom with a delivery, he comes home for a brief period to eat dinner. We don't know, right? Is he able to do any schoolwork in the evening, or does he have to head off to class?
Exactly. And we have that a little hint of that here. Perhaps he's using this table right now. Either he's coming home, he's just set his books and his slate on the table and is ready to help his mother, or he is just about to leave to go to night school after spending a day at 14 years old working to get a wage for the family. Because labor here is being paid for, like I said, in both wages and goods. And so you can imagine how important a wage would be to this family.
And how much, again, right? It's like day to day, week to week. That for someone like Lewis, maybe his day to day is changing the most, right? Maybe some weeks his help isn't needed and he's able to focus more on school. So we see sort of that kind of instability that a lot of members of this household are working through, and how they might become even more, like you were saying, right? We tend to imagine this idea of a nuclear family when we think about the idea of family. But this household, this home really invites us to kind of think beyond that, right? And think about how this household is making a family. I want to pause this because we've looked at a lot of stuff in here. I'm sure we have questions, comments. We'd love to know just what else you are curious about, what else you want to know.
Okay, so the chat has been filled with amazing connections and so many things coming back to special objects within people's homes that have been passed from generation to generation. A lot of them being furniture, dishware. I think a lot of them involve cooking and cooking traditions, which has been great to see. And then, there was a question of were the copper foot warmers, were they expensive? Would this have been a luxury item for Joseph and other coachmen?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And also, I mean, just thank you all for sharing your connections, these objects that have been passed down within your families. We'll talk about that a bit later, but, we can think, many of these objects were in someone's ancestor's home at some point. And although these were not kept in families, right, they've ended up here in our museum. I always love thinking about whose kitchen these objects were in the 1860s, in the 1870s, right? All these objects have another story before they help us tell our story here.
Exactly.
But yeah, the foot warmer.
Yeah.
So what do we think? I mean,
it's really interesting to think about this because you have the tools of the trade. So those are things that are absolutely necessary to do the work. And so we have this stove here. This stove is likely one of the most expensive things in the house. Perhaps the family could have pooled their money together, or Joseph and Rachel own it and would have brought it from their other locations with them from house to house. When you think about his job as a coachman or as a waiter, what would be required is the uniform. And so that's where you have to have the items in order to do your job. You need the cloak, you need the tie. We even have a waiter's manual on exactly what you needed to look like and present to be a waiter. That's where wages would have gone. This item, the foot warmer, is a luxury item. And so we can think of it as perhaps something that they would have bought secondhand. Perhaps they inherited it from another coachman who could have been leaving, or they might have pulled their money to purchase it because his feet got really cold and he needs his feet to be healthy if he's going to be a waiter in the summer. That's something to think about, like the longevity of doing these positions.
Yeah.
So,
and I think that's a really important point too, just of how the work that Black New Yorkers were doing was work that was harder on their bodies, right? This, white employers in the city are relegating Black Americans to, some of the most marginal jobs that take a toll. Sickness and just the wear on one's body was a major concern for the Black middle class, trying to, think about how as a wider community, Black Americans were deciding where to live, right? Was the city safest? Was the countryside safest? So we can take something, like this foot warmer and actually, bring it out into this much bigger story about what Joseph might have been considering and how Joseph and Rachel might have been consistently revisiting this idea of where to live, right? Where can they live? Where is safest? Where is healthiest? And what jobs are accessible, right? That Black men really professionalize this work of being a waiter. Joseph enters this industry at this time when there was this history of professionalization and when things start to turn, right? So maybe he's even more concerned about keeping his job, getting customers. Something like this foot warmer might make him more of a competitive coachman.
He could stay out there longer on the really cold days and he doesn't need to return home or step inside to get warm. Yeah. So we can think about these objects in the way that they're acquired and the way that we think about cost today is very different than the way that things were acquired or purchased back then. And when we go into the other room, we'll see as well the sewing machine, which is often something that people purchased on layaway, would loan to each other, and was not necessarily a single cash purchase.
Yeah, which reminded me too, you was thinking about like an older coachman. In the building actually is a man who's, I think he's 70, James Smith. He is also from New Jersey, and he maybe is the one kind of advising Joseph on this work of being a coachman. So thinking about sort of two Black New Yorkers a generation apart as neighbors, maybe they're exchanging stories about where they came from in New Jersey. You better keep your feet warm. This is number one advice, but just makes me think about sort of taxi drivers today in the city and how they might be exchanging advice and how this happens in any industry and how essential that kind of mutual aid, both formal and informal, is.
Absolutely.
And that this, sort of sense of mutual aid and community also extends to like the downtime that people have, right? We've spent a lot of time talking about work and how much of a challenge it would be to run this household and, kind of have everyone's schedules overlapping. We've actually set up the front room of this apartment for sort of a different dynamic, right? A Sunday. And this was also a reference from that washerwoman piece because McEwen Smith talks about how different Saturday would be from Sunday, how on Sunday, all of the work is put away. So let's go into the next room. And we'll take more questions later, but we'll come in here and the piece in here that I always love focusing on when thinking about Sunday and thinking about how different this is that everyone in this family is Catholic, right? And that going to church on Sunday might be something, perhaps, we don't know for sure, but going to Mass might be something they do together. And I've been really thinking about Rachel and Jane and Rose getting ready to go to church. And we are looking now at this wash basin, this sort of dresser. What do you think about when you look at this? What sort of can we like find out about some of these objects and how they help us understand their lives?
So obviously there's not a lot of space, and we have 3 adult women in this space sharing the space. And so you would have only one set, perhaps, of cosmetic items that the women are sharing. Maybe they would have their own comb. You can see here that there's a pile of different combs. So perhaps they had their own comb, their own devices, but they would definitely be sharing washcloths and also this basin. So there's no running water. They are going outdoors to a water pump. They would be filling it up and then using that water for cooking, washing, washing clothes, and also washing their bodies. And so, like we were having the discussion before in the kitchen, it's really interesting to think about how much things cost. And so, looking at this beautiful piece, they're a matching set. It's a gorgeous pitcher and basin, but they could be getting this secondhand. So many, many items were sold off the street, secondhand. They could have also received this in return for washing again.
Or maybe like their employer is just getting rid of things. I think about, sort of wealthier families in New York. They have new items constantly, and that maybe, Rachel or Rose brings this home from a job.
Right.
And that's a good point, sort of thinking about like where things are coming from, maybe secondhand if they're not being bought new. And it just makes me think about, we didn't talk about this in the kitchen, but just the yard of this building and how much that's a space where women are sharing advice, talking about what's going on in their lives, that really becomes a community space. And so if you come on the tour, right, you'll get to learn more about the sort of community of the rear yard. We really use that to talk about how, Black and Irish New Yorkers were, forming community, and then how particularly Black New Yorkers were forming institutions like churches.
Absolutely.
Within the neighborhood.
I also like to think about the intimacy of this because it's this apartment's really remarkable. We have Black and white New Yorkers living together, and then we have Black and white women doing cosmetic rituals together, and those are different. They're doing different cosmetics, and so we also have a really interesting industry in the United States for Black women's hair care and skincare during this time period. And so that's like a potential area of research that I'm really intrigued in, is like, what were these hygiene rituals that the women were participating in, and how were they similar and how were they different?
Yeah, absolutely, right. And how tenement homes within the 8th Ward become these really unique spaces, right? Where Black and Irish New Yorkers are not only sharing homes, in some cases sharing bedrooms, forming families, right? Within Joseph and Rachel's building, there are 6 families where there's an Irish woman married to a Black man. And how, some of those sort of distinctions might come out in these day-to-day routines, right? Just makes me wonder, like, what are they talking about?
Exactly.
And how are they exchanging advice or not?
Right.
So yeah, if we step a little further into the space, I mean, we get to see, right, this is the main bedroom. Joseph and Rachel sleep in here in this larger bed, and then Jane probably sleeps in the smaller bed, right? She's Rachel's stepdaughter, although at this point, I'm sure Rachel doesn't think about her as a stepdaughter, right? Rachel married, Jane's father when Jane was only 3, I think. So, that she's her daughter, and
They're living together as adults.
Exactly. And so this is maybe more of the family space during the week, and that Rose and Louis maybe sleep in the kitchen, right? That space sort of converts into a bedroom. So we, start to get a sense of the sleeping arrangements, but then Jane's also working in here, right? I mean, you were talking about the sewing machine. So although on Sunday that work might not be happening, there's still a presence of it here.
Right. And this sewing machine is very cool. It's a hand cranked sewing machine as opposed to a pedal cranked sewing machine. So this is a much smaller and more compact device. It's also not necessarily used in the same way that some of our other apartments, if you've been to these other apartments, where they're taking on piecework, they're really using it as a industrial business inside their home. This is much more compact and smaller. And so to demonstrate it, which I will not do, but you use your right hand to guide the fabric through, and then the left hand is cranking, which moves the needle up and down. And so we have this cute little textile corner where
that's a lot of coordination, though. I guess I didn't really realize how it actually works.
You're doing two at once. You're pushing it and then cranking it, and so the hand that's pushing is also guiding to make sure that the stitch is even. So this is a very skilled task. This isn't necessarily something that every single person would know how to do.
Yeah.
And like I said before, this sewing machine is an expensive item. Many people were getting them on layaway. So you can think about what it means to have the sewing machine, what it means to have one that's not as technologically advanced or not as quick as perhaps other ones, but then the skill that you would need to operate it.
Right, and that Jane's working as a dressmaker, and in Marquise's research into, in particular, he looked at the ads for the Weekly Anglo-African, one of the big Black newspapers at the time, and you see a lot of Black women advertising their dressmaking services.
Exactly.
So we couldn't find one, unfortunately, for Jane, so we don't know exactly how she was finding customers or how she was keeping up with the latest style.
Right.
But we know that this is work that there were, other Black women in the neighborhood were doing. So maybe she's connected to them for advice on how to, okay, I have this hand crank machine. How do I use this as compared to, one with a foot pedal?
And also, where would she take clients? You have to do the measurements. You have to get the design ready. And so a lot of times these dressmaking patterns, women would select a pattern and then select the fabric and have someone produce that design for them. So we can even think of this space as not just domestic for the family, but there's other people from the community that are coming in here and helping use this space, whether they're clients, whether they're friends. Their space is not just exclusive to the family.
Yeah, that's a interesting thing to think about, because as New Yorkers, I feel like some of us are not as accustomed to, we meet our friends out somewhere, right? We go out to eat rather than inviting people over, because our spaces tend to be small, and especially for this household where they have only 2 rooms, right? They live in this rear tenement that's behind a front tenement. They don't have a whole lot of space. How are they negotiating, that work and then this as being a bedroom, maybe a living room, and then on Sunday, does Jane sort of get the day off, or does she have to catch up with some work that she missed?
Right.
And it makes me think too, even if she's sort of altering or maybe even making dresses for Rachel or for Rose, who she's sharing this household with. And when they go to Mass, if they do, I mean, we know Joseph and Rachel were both baptized as adults at St. Anthony de Padua, which is a church that today is still around. It's just maybe about 15 minutes from here. So we know they're Catholic, and we have a crucifix on the wall here with a rosary, which, we've been starting to do more research into, the sort of ways that different communities over time were part of Catholicism in New York. So more to come on that in the coming months. But just thinking about the importance of a rosary, of this crucifix. And this one also came from Europe, this particular one, right? You were saying?
This was acquired in France. Once again, we wanted to prioritize objects that were of the time period. So this is a crucifix from the 1860s. And it's just really fascinating to think about material culture and where things are available. There are tons of sewing machines in the United States, but it's difficult to find a historic crucifix. And so thinking about that, thinking about what your family has potentially passed down, maybe these items have stayed in families over generations and they haven't entered the antiques marketplace.
Right, of thinking about what becomes more precious to a family and is more likely to be passed down versus something
sold
that is sold or gotten rid of as families change and move, which I hadn't thought about it in exactly those terms, but that's such a good point, right? How religious items might be more likely to be kept and passed down, right? We have so many on our digital exhibit, Your Story, Our Story, right? We have so many examples of rosaries and candlesticks and these sort of sacred items that have been handed from one generation to the next. So we, don't have any of Joseph and Rachel or Rose and Lewis's actual rosaries or crucifixes. And, are looking, further afield for something to, think about their faith and how that's kind of grounding them and anchoring them day to day, week to week. And how also church becomes a place for celebration, for joy, for stability. That in this parlor we tell the story of a particular moment in 1870 of the passage of the 15th Amendment, right? This is time period that Joseph and Rachel and their household are living through, probably the decade of the most change in the United States, right? We have, the end of the Civil War, the abolition of slavery in 1865, and these Reconstruction amendments that culminate in the 15th Amendment, which guarantee men like Joseph, black men who'd been fighting for the right to vote for decades, guarantee them the protection of the right to vote. And that in this neighborhood, the 8th Ward, there's a parade thrown for this, this moment that becomes a real pinnacle of this activism and this work. And we can imagine this household maybe going to the parade. There is an article that we found that actually describes how, as part of the decorations for the parade, there were American flags that were decorated with mottos. Things like, "Out of Egypt I have brought my children. By the bullet we gained the ballot." And these mottos are stitched onto these American flags. And I really just can't stop thinking about Jane.
Right, exactly. Imagine Jane stitching these.
At her hand crank machine, stitching these letters into a flag, maybe hanging it out of their window. Right. But how, the church, particularly black churches, although their church wasn't exclusively a black church, but become these real hubs for political, social, community action. And that means we get to turn to, I think, what might be your favorite object in this space.
Yeah.
I know you were going to say that about
all of the objects.
But we know, so there's a portrait of Abraham Lincoln on the mantle here, and it's often one of the first things that people notice when they come into this space. Understandably, he's, of course, a recognizable figure. We found an article from I think it was from the late 1880s, actually, so much later than when they're in this apartment. And it describes how Joseph had a portrait of Abraham Lincoln in the apartment where he was living. Right. He had moved back to Jersey at this point. So we can, safely sort of assume that he would have had a portrait of Lincoln in the 1870s, maybe even earlier. And this one has sort of a particularly special story, right?
Exactly. Also in that Washerwoman article as well, they talk about how on the wall there's a Lincoln portrait. And so we just see time and time again the mention of Lincoln in Black domestic spaces, and particularly in reverence on a mantle. And so I love this image. This is a facsimile or a reproduction of a mourning card. So after Lincoln's assassination, I want to say the entire United States, but we know that some people were, not in mourning about the assassination. But there was a national period of mourning, and this really coincided as well with the mourning culture of the post-Civil War era, where so many Americans had lost their lives. It was a really interesting time period. And so this is a portrait of Lincoln that someone has then taken fresh flowers and made a decorative wreath again around it, and then re-photographed that wreath around the portrait of Lincoln. So this is a photograph of a decorated photograph. I love photography during this time, Civil War, mourning period, what Lincoln meant. But this was a ubiquitous object. These were sent around to families. You could purchase them in any ephemera store. Even at this parade, there would have been people handing out leaflets or mourning flyers of Lincoln. And so this is from an actual collection of mourning cards. And I just love this one because it is the photo of the photo. It shows the technology in the image. And it shows just how important Lincoln was, that people were creating these types of images.
Yeah, and it really just gets me thinking too about Joseph and Rachel being here, in New York at the time when Lincoln was assassinated. Maybe they go to, Lincoln's body was brought,
His
right?
death procession.
His procession.
Right down Fifth Avenue.
Maybe they go, and this is a moment when people are coming together, and then what it would feel like to sort of see, some of that work that Lincoln had started in these Reconstruction amendments come to fruition with the 15th Amendment, and then how this might also then spark debate in the rear yard, or we know there was a dance hall in the neighborhood, or even at the parade itself, right? This sort of back and forth within the community about how people should be feeling in this moment, right? That in particular, the leading Black reverend in the neighborhood, William Butler, he, was the reverend at the AME Zion Church on Bleecker Street, not far away from where Joseph and Rachel lived. And he gathered the community for a speech only a few weeks after, the parade, and cautioned, basically saying, like, it's time to get to work, right?
Yeah.
That the 15th Amendment would not be enough to sort of hold, the United States to this promise that the change to the Constitution was making. And so, we see this Lincoln portrait on the wall, and, makes me wonder, right, for this household, for Joseph and Rachel, who, Rachel wouldn't yet be able to vote.
Yes.
Within her lifetime, she did not see that right. But just how it was a moment of real hope, and how people were working to hold on to that hope amidst, continued sort of setbacks and, often the sort of reality of needing to continue to fight this fight.
Right. And even Rose, too. Like, her son is half Black. What did this mean for her son, who now has the right to vote in the United States? So thinking about this, too, from multiple people's perspective, and what this meant for everyone in different but really important ways.
Yeah, and, we sort of bring the tour to an end by thinking about, like, what Joseph might have told his children. He doesn't have any children with Rachel, and we don't exactly know what happens to Rachel. We are fairly sure she passes sometime in the 1870s, but Joseph goes on to move back to New Jersey with his mother, stepfather, one of his siblings, and he gets remarried to a woman named Frances, and they have 3 children. So it's really gotten me thinking about what he might be telling his children about this moment that he lived through, what stories are passing down through the generations, what objects, as we've been talking about, might have been handed down, and we can't know what faith, right? What sense of how you keep hope, which I always think is so important to consider, right? What are sort of the non-material things that pass down within families, right? The sense of how you maintain hope, of keeping strength, of the importance of forming community, in addition to what objects might be handed as precious sort of sacred items through generations, or as just everyday objects that you acquire from your family, and you don't really know what to do with. But we don't have any of that specifically for Joseph and Rachel, right? We haven't been able to follow the family line through all the way to today. So it's been through a descendant of Joseph's uncle, Ashley Pinkowski, that we've been able to learn a little bit more about sort of the wider family of the Moores. Joseph's uncle, Aaron Huff, was still living in the area where Joseph was from in New Jersey. And Ashley has been generous enough to come visit us, to start sharing stories. And she's going to be a big part of our gala, right? On May 2nd, to share just, what this exhibit means to her, to be able to hear sort of these personal stories that are really not as often included in how we think about, kind of the bigger story of this time period.
Right. And it's so interesting to think about her and how her stories might further define this space. Because as we've been talking this whole hour, I believe.
We're almost time to go to more questions.
Almost time for more questions. As we've been talking, we've been speaking about the different sources. So we have these essays, we have nonfiction, we have fiction accounts, we have stories from the general public, we have newspaper articles. We also have to put in the oral stories, and that oral tradition is so important into creating the space that we're standing in right now.
Yeah, and I'm sure many of you, right, have been, for example, in the Baldizzi apartment, where we are able to, bring Josephine Baldizzi, the daughter of that family, back to this building. She helped us recreate the space. We don't have that for Joseph and Rachel's home that we're in now, right? So thinking about how maybe stories from Ashley, or perhaps even objects that she donates to the museum, might become part of the way that we're able to tell the story here. And let's go back to more questions.
Sure.
See what else people are curious about. Anything else? Or anything else that just catches your eye that you want to know more about?
Anything about the process? This is like Kat said in the beginning, this is the first time we are doing a virtual in-person tour. So this is as new for us as it is for you. And we're just happy to answer any questions about anything that the Tenement Museum is involved in right now.
Yes. So can you guys hear me okay from here?
Yes, we can.
Great. So I think we have two questions, and kind of a series of questions that came in, I think, about almost like two dichotomies or elements of these tenement apartments. One was people noticing the needlework and the lace, and I think the things that make this apartment a home and turn it into a personal space. So they were kind of asking for you to comment on that piece. And then on the other side, we talked about this a little bit in the chat, was thinking about what it would be like to be in these spaces when that stove is going, and when you're bringing up new buckets of coal and there's steam in the air. I think a lot of people really kind of catching on to that visceral kind of sensory piece that you all were describing. So I think if you guys want to comment on those two pieces, it's been a very lively chat.
That's
wonderful.
Great. And I think about that a lot, just on the sensory, like what it would feel like to be in this space, because so often, we're in this home. It doesn't have any soot on the walls, right? We don't recreate those pieces, which I like to think about. This is how Rachel would want us to present her household, but also is important to remember, right? That that coal stove is giving off an immense amount of soot that's filling the air, that's covering the walls, right? That this would be, a huge project to actually clean the space. And maybe also reminds us that people living in tenements are also spending a lot of time outside of their apartments, right? That rear yard becomes so important, these saloon spaces, right? That
the marketplace on the street where they're picking up oysters, any of this.
and how there's sort of that extension of the home. But that's always, part of the storytelling of the family on tours is just what does it actually feel like to be in here, right?
Exactly. And so like you can notice too, like we have these antique fixtures, but they're electric. We're not having actual kerosene in these spaces.
Oh, no.
So it's a really interesting tension in this museum in particular, the tension between preservation and authenticity. And so again, here, this is like that same concept that we can imagine the way it feels, but in this space right now, it's quite delightfully cool. And so it's not necessarily the way it would feel if Rachel was at the stove cooking dinner.
Right. So we have to use our imaginations and kind of activate a different part of our thinking to kind of help bring that part of the space to the tour. Yeah, it's a good point about the electric lights would pretty different than the way kerosene would smell.
Exactly. One thing too that I would love to point out is that one of the beautiful things about the Tenement Museum is kind of changing people's perspective on what life was like for the poor and the working poor. And so we have these classic, this is a different era, but we have those Jacob Riis photos that are really telling people how terrible it is and really showing for activists and for reformers in order to make those changes. This space is beautiful because you have people living in here who are making it beautiful. And so we have items that are from the time period. On this bed is an actual quilt from the 1800s. And so this was, if people talking about most expensive items, this is one of the most expensive items that was purchased for the apartment was this quilt. And so quilting has such a long history and tradition, particularly with the Black American community. But we're thinking about how people are taking secondhand items, they're taking items that are potentially scraps from the washerwoman business, and they're using them to make their space beautiful. They are embroidering American flags with slogans and messages. They are embroidering their own clothing. They're crocheting shawls. And so when you come to the space on the tour, you'll be able to peek into the closet and see the hats that have been festooned with feathers and lace. You'll be able to see all of these really beautiful items that the family has created for themselves. And, despite their income or lack thereof, has created a beautiful working space.
Yeah. And there's actually, a couple of other textile pieces in the kitchen that might be a good way for us to come back and talk a little bit more about some of the lace work, some of the sort of crochet, these different, let me actually come over here. We see the mix actually is some of this crochet. I'm actually not.
These are all crochet.
These are all crochet.
They're all crochet.
And then we see the lace work on the curtains,
Exactly.
right? So this mix of like handiwork and crafting and then decoration. Maybe some of these things were purchased.
What techniques were brought? Because Irish crochet is particularly delicate and beautiful. How much of this is the roommates contributing to the beauty of the home? That's one of my favorite things to think about is like who's decorating?
Who's making the choices
who's making
and
the choices and decoration?
It's a good point. It's hard to agree on even today.
Exactly.
A question that we often get, which maybe we've already had in the chat, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about is just for the fabric and the textile pieces, like how hard is that to maintain and conserve? And when when you're looking for the textile items to put into the space, like is it harder to find things from this time period?
Absolutely, absolutely. So the easiest source for materials is actually reenactor clothing. So Joseph's cape and his boots are reenactor boots, and a reenactor cape from the time period. But it's really interesting to find what things that are available. So stockings are actually quite available. Bloomers are easy to acquire, and the crochet. It's actually
And bloomers are like what you would wear under your
yes,
skirt.
like these.
Is that right?
These
are
are
bloomers
right
okay,
here.
good. Just you know.
But the crochet is one of those things that I think because it's so beautiful, it's preserved and it tends to be passed down. So that's one of the easier things to actually find. Are those handmade items like the quilts, the crochet. It's the everyday kind of manufactured items that people wear and they don't save. It's the really the handmade or the really beautiful that gets saved and passed down. Whereas the everyday, the germane gets used, gets worn, gets darned. There's a little blue darning on that. And so those things are difficult to find.
Yeah, right. And then thinking about where the historians of the future who want to recreate 2024, where will they find, our clothing to put in the space? I want to make sure we have time for maybe another question if there are any.
Yeah.
Yes, so the chat has been great. Everyone has loved that they felt like they got to walk around the apartment with you all. I think people also had like questions about recreating the physical space. They were asking what floor did they live on, how much rent was. I think some people had been here before and were thinking about like 2 rooms versus 3 rooms. So maybe I think we've gotten to really talk about the objects. Oh, how many windows were there was another comment. Rhonda is very interested in the physical space, which has been asking great questions. So I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about the walls that are housing all these objects.
Yeah. So this is a unique space in the tenement because all of the other spaces have that bedroom, kitchen, parlor layout that's equal on both sides. And so when we were doing the construction for this space, we actually moved the wall over and the floor plan, the floor plan isn't identical to the Morris floor plan, but the square footage is. So they had exactly this much space, actually a little bit more in the kitchen and a little bit less in the living room, but it was set up nearly exactly like this.
Yeah, and it was only a 2-room apartment, right? So like you were saying, it's different than the apartments here at 97, so we had to do that modification, like what you were just talking about, physically modify. Right. I don't even think I knew that.
Yeah, so it's the exact same square footage, which we were able to verify through building records.
Right,
but they were in a rear yard tenement, right? So this is, when we're standing right now, is on the 5th floor of 97th Orchard. We talked about earlier about carrying the coal and carrying the water up. They're closer to that water source and closer to the noise and closer to the smell as well.
And we actually do know the records were fairly spotty, but I think from that same floor plan that you were mentioning, we know that their building was a 5-story building.
Right.
So that it might have had on some of the floors more light than a lot of the rear tenements that tended to be shorter. But the front building on their lot was only a 2-story building, right? So thinking about even with front and back buildings, how different the insides might have been. The front building was one that would have been subdivided, whereas this back building that they lived in, was built as a tenement, as an apartment building. So it was a lot of piecework, a lot of detective work. We don't know exactly how many windows there would have been, right? There's likely 2 exterior windows, but perhaps not a window between the 2 rooms. We don't know for sure. So a lot of the pieces, again, as with so much of the work of historians, we have to take the sources that we know, right, that we can find, and then connect a lot of dots. Right.
And also, we are custodians of this beautiful historic building. And so we're recreating this space to tell the story in a space that's very different from where the story is actually occurring. So we're limited by the physical architecture of 97 Orchard, but then can use it as an opportunity to create this 2-story or this 2-room apartment, and compare that with the other tenement apartments that we have and how their lives were different, how they were similar.
Yeah, absolutely. Which, is such an important point to end on, just the opportunity that this exhibit presents us to tell the story of a Black family in a tenement for the first time in the museum's history. to fulfill a plea from a woman, Jean Emmanuel, who wrote the museum a letter in 1989 about her own family who lived in tenements, her own ancestors, the stories that have been passed down, her plea to the Tenement Museum to not forget the stories of Black New Yorkers in tenements. So while there are the limitations of these walls, there is the expansiveness of being able to understand the stories of people like Joseph and Rachel, of Jean Emmanuel's ancestors, and to hear how their descendants reflect on this history, right? We are going to close out our official portion of this, and I will invite you all to tune in to our gala on May 2nd, where we explore this idea from generation to generation, how we are a nation of grandchildren and great-great-great-great-grandchildren in the case of Ashley Pinkowski. Aaron Huff was 4 or 5 generations removed, and yet his story and the story of Joseph and Rachel carry forward in a way that we'll get to discuss and dig into more on May 2nd. It is going to be on our YouTube channel where you are right now. There's a link in the chat. Don't stay put. That's like 3 weeks away. You can leave and come back. But tune in on May 2nd. And as always, we hope to see you at a program coming up, including the gala. Thank you all so much for your questions, sharing about your family's objects. It's been an absolute honor to test this virtual visit with all of you and with you.
Thank you so much, Kat. This has been so much fun. Thank you all for participating, and I hope you join us again for another program or for our gala.
Yeah, take care.
All right.